My name's Jeremy Johnson. I'm in practice at 5 Essex Court. I was called in '94 and I specialise primarily in public law, public inquiries, acting mainly for police, government departments and other public authorities.
My name's Harry Adamson. I'm at Blackstone Chambers. My practice covers most of the things that Blackstone does, but at the moment it's mainly public law and human rights and commercial law.
My name is Greatorex. I'm at 11 KBW. I was called in 1999. I do mainly public law, but I also do employment and commercial.
All right. As I say, we'll each speak for 5 or 10 minutes about a little bit about ourselves and about practising in public law. I applied for pupillage in '93. And at that stage, although I knew I wanted to come to the bar, I had no idea which area I wanted to practice in. And so to say I chose a particular area of law or even a particular chambers is completely misleading. A, because I didn't, and B, because I wasn't in a position to choose. If anyone had offered me a pupillage, I'd have snapped their hands off, no matter which area it was. And so I've ended up where I am, really, by a series of accidents, I'm afraid. But when I applied, because I didn't know precisely which areas I wanted to do, I applied for mixed common law sets that did a broad range of work. And I was really more interested in the atmosphere of the chambers, the ethos of the chambers, whether the chambers were expanding and seeming to do well, how they looked after pupils, what the ratio was of pupils being offered pupillage to pupils being offered tenancy at the end of the process. And those sorts of figures really were more predominant in my mind than the precise practice areas. But as I say, by a series of accidents, I ended up doing the area of work I am. Those accidents, I suppose, started off with my pupillage, where one of my pupil supervisors did a lot of work for government, did a lot of public interest immunity applications, which was a pretty narrow field at the time. And that got me interested in that area of law, and I did some of that work in my very early years. But then the development in chambers really was through the Treasury panels. As most of you probably know, the government maintains panels of barristers to represent government in civil litigation. And I progressed through the panels and in doing that narrowed the areas in which I specialised. So to start with, I was doing a broad range of work, including some commercial work, some landlord and tenant, a lot of personal injury work. But over the years narrowed the areas down so that more recently I'm doing almost predominantly public inquiries and public law work, as well as some private law work for the police and government departments. My practice at the moment it involves, right at the moment, I'm doing the Al-Swedi public inquiry for the Ministry of Defence, which is a public inquiry into allegations of abuse of Iraqi civilians in 2004. That'll come to an end at the end of this month, and then I'll be doing the Hillsborough inquests. And at the same time as doing those sort of long-running cases, I'm doing judicial review challenges, as I say, mainly for the police and government departments. So challenges, for example, to the stop and search legislation, challenges to retention of data by the police, and that sort of thing. The reasons I particularly enjoy public inquiry, public law work are, I suppose, that I find it very interesting. I find the work very satisfying. It's pretty self-contained, so a case will run within a fairly confined space of time from pre-action through to a substantive judicial review hearing. The cases tend to be heard by High Court and Court of Appeal judges, so you're exposed to senior members of the judiciary, and it's particularly stimulating and exciting and interesting doing that work. There's not a great deal of travel, which for some will be an advantage, for some might be a disadvantage, but most of the work, certainly historically, has taken place in London. The Administrative Court now operates in regional centres as well, but certainly it's more London-based than many other areas of practice. The main disadvantage from my personal point of view is the relative lack of witness handling work, because most of it tends to be dealt with on the papers. It's relatively rare in a judicial review hearing to have live evidence. I quite enjoy examining and cross-examining witnesses, so that's one thing that public law doesn't give a great opportunity to do, but that's why I quite enjoy having the counterbalance of the public inquiry work, where there's more witness handling than you could wish for. So that's a very brief potted history of my biography and the sort of cases I do. I'll hand over to Harry.
Okay, thank you very much. I understand it might say on your programmes that you're expecting a talk from Brian Kennelly at Blackstone Chambers. I'm not Brian Kennelly. My name's Harry Adamson. I hope you're not too disappointed. If you are, I can only assure you that you're not as disappointed as I am not to be Brian Kennelly, and that's a disappointment I have to live with every day. I am one of the most, well, I'm joint most junior tenant at Blackstone Chambers. I thought it would be therefore useful for me to concentrate on what you're about to go through, because I've only just been through that, and if you have any questions about the immediate process, pupillage and all of that stuff, please do feel free to ask at the end. I do want this, we've only got 5 minutes, but I'd like it to be as useful to you guys as possible, and that's partly because I attended this talk only, I think, 4 years ago as an audience member, and I found it incredibly useful, it was very instrumental in helping me to make up my mind to go to the bar at all. That was the stage that I was at the time. With that in mind, can I just take a quick show of hands? Who here has already made up their mind to become a lawyer, either through the GDL or a law degree? Okay, almost everyone. How many people have decided already to be a barrister? Again, almost everyone. How many have already made up their minds to go into public law and human rights? Very few. Okay, that's really useful to know. So at the time I attended this talk, I wasn't a lawyer at all. I was a philosopher. I say that sounds grander than it is. I was studying philosophy, and I was also teaching philosophy as well. It was something that I was really fascinated in. And I was particularly interested in the parts of philosophy to do with ethics and to do with political theory. I always knew I didn't want to be an academic, and the public law bar was incredibly attractive because it allows you to air the kinds of arguments that you have in philosophical ethics or political theory, but you do it in an arena that's tightly controlled by a judge, and at the end of it you get a result, and that's radically different from philosophy, but the result can be something that you can then say proudly to yourself, well, I have caused something to happen, and that might be, if you're lucky, something worthwhile. And that was really what drew me to it. Now, well, so that's how I was led to the bar. I thought one thing that was very, very useful when I was going through the application processes, and I apologise in advance, it's got a reputation for being quite a long and brutal process. Like many things with a reputation, there is an element of truth to that. And so the most useful single piece of advice that I got before I was asked, or before I decided to go through it, was you will be asked, or you have had to make a load of choices to get where you are now, and will have to make more choices to get to a particular chambers and practicing a particular area of law. When you are going into your interviews and when you are filling in your pupillage application forms, you will be asked, why did you make those choices? Now, that's a very obvious thing to say, but the person on the other end who's asking those questions of everybody will have received a lot of very similar answers, which are Well, I like thinking a lot, and I want to do nice things, and I'm good at public speaking. It'll be something along those lines. It is such a comfort if you are sitting in those interviews to be able to point to particular lines on your CV and say, this is what I did, this is what I learned, this was the experience that justified the choice I made to become a lawyer, to choose this chambers, to enter into this area of law. And now that can be anything. That can be law related. It can be, you can go and work in the Citizens Advice Bureau. You can go and work for a legally related NGO. But it doesn't need to be law related. It can be there's such a wide plethora of skills that are useful to a barrister. So anything to do with performance. So if you like to act, if you like to do music, if you have any particular cause that you're passionate about, go out and advocate for it. And any of that is extremely impressive. And it's just a great comfort for you when it gets round to those choices. Mini-pupillages are another example, and marshalling is another. So that you can just say, this is why I'm here, and this is why you should take me. Now that I'm on the other side, what kind of cases I'm doing? Well, I mentioned that I do two areas of law, mainly public law and human rights and commercial law, which is mainly fraud. I don't know if the other panel members will agree with me, but at the very junior end, I think it's very rare that someone starts and just immediately does only public law and only does human rights. So one thing that you should think about is potentially other areas that you would like to combine that with, because human rights and public law principles pop up all the time. If you're doing employment law, you're often thinking along human rights lines. Sports law, which Blackstone do a lot, you can basically challenge the decisions of, say, the FA, basically on judicial review and often human rights grounds. A famous case that Blackstone Chambers did to do with Guantanamo Bay involved applying an obscure principle called the Norwich Pharmacal principle to a human rights case, which, on the basis of which the government might have had to disclose a lot of very unfortunate documents to do with extraordinary rendition of the British detainee in Guantanamo Bay, and that was extremely useful. So keep broad, keep in mind other areas you want to do, and be prepared to combine it with other areas. I think that's the end of my 5 minutes. As I say, please do feel free to ask particular questions that you're interested in. Without further ado, I hand you over to Paul.
Thank you. As I say, my name is Paul Greatorex. I'm at 11 KBW. When I was really the opposite, I think, of Jeremy, when I was applying for chambers, I knew I wanted to do public law very much, and I applied to chambers that did that. And I got an offer of pupillage at 4 to 5 Gray's Inn Square, which back then in 1998 was the #1 public law set, and I was delighted. But although I had that very clearly in mind, I think probably like most people when they apply to the bar, when you're at that stage of your education, you probably don't realise what that actually means on a day-to-day basis. You know, you've got a general interest in that area of law, but it's very difficult unless you spend an awful lot of time talking to junior tenants and then people more senior to be able to see, exactly what that involves. And at its broadest, it's really following on from what Harry was saying. I think at its broadest, there's not much point going to the bar thinking I just want to do pure public law from day one and nothing else, because that's not going to happen. The way that most public law sets of chambers, or chambers that say they do public law, you will find is always combined with other principal areas. So my chambers, for example, 11 KBW, is employment's the other very big area that they do. There are other sets which combine public and planning, is another big area, and so on and so forth. So I think really it's a question of picking the chambers that has the right sort of the blend that appeals to you, and you've got to be realistic about what you're going to be doing on a day-to-day basis. So with that in mind, what might you be doing in a public law set of chambers? I mean, the answer can vary enormously depending on which particular set you're in and which particular cases you end up doing. But at its most at its broadest, and to state the obvious, it means you're going to be doing either representing or bringing claims against public bodies of one description or another. And the two biggest categories, really, of public bodies that you're likely to be involved with are central government departments and local authorities. Probably, if you look to the next biggest after that, you'd have NHS bodies, police, and various other branches of public life. But within that, there's an enormous array of work that you could be doing. So I think what I'm going to do, just in the few minutes I've got, is talk about the sort of cases that I did and do. That's just to give you a flavour. Someone else at a different set would give you a very different picture of the sort of cases that they're doing. Within, as I say, within public law, my first contact really was through local authority clients, advising them on what their powers were, occasionally getting involved in judicial reviews. I did quite a lot of planning. I still do quite a bit of planning, which has a lot of public law principles at play in it. Of course, human rights tends to overlap with everything. But then you get into specific areas like education. I do an awful lot of education law, which, depending on how you classify your practice, you either say, well, it's part of my public law practice, or it stands on its own. You say, I'm an education barrister. But those cases are for local authorities, for schools, for academies, occasionally for the Department for Education, Ofsted, and so on. And then there are other particular areas within local authority, areas that I do quite a lot of, such as planning, mental capacity type cases. And then for the government work, I am on the government panel of council, so that's where most of my judicial review work comes from. That involves a lot of immigration. It involved quite a bit of national security work, public inquiry work, as Jeremy mentioned, and then bits and pieces that it's impossible really to sort of classify, but just comes along. It's a question about what the powers the public body has, and whether they're acting lawfully, and so on. And of course, on the other side of that, if you're thinking about going to what might be called a claimant set, then it's more or less the same, just from the other side. The public law bar is relatively polarised, and I think you probably do need to be reasonably clear in your mind about whether you want to spend more of your time defending public authorities or more of your time bringing cases against them, because that's the reality of the way that most chambers divide. But that's not to say that you have to pick one and stick with it forevermore, and most chambers, and certainly the good ones, have a good mix of people who do work on both sides, and individuals who regularly switch sides between them. But in practical terms, and certainly starting out and when you're looking at chambers, you wouldn't be wrong if you notice this sort of basic divide between the sets that are out there. Just to add to what Jeremy said earlier about what's appealing or what's not appealing about it, I would agree with everything that Jeremy said. One thing that you may well have on your minds is the financial rewards. Like any area really, it depends how successful you are. A successful public lawyer will earn far more than a not very successful commercial lawyer or barrister. Even though if one's looking generally, I would say public law is probably to the middle to the lower end of the remuneration of the bar as a whole. That's just my personal impression. I don't have all the facts and figures. I mean, the criminal bar and the family bar seems to be suffering an awful lot at the moment. At the commercial end, if you get into a good set and doing big commercial cases, big tax cases, then I think they're probably at the top end. But I wouldn't worry too much about that, because it's going to be a well-paid career if you're successful at it, and that's probably what matters more. But if you really want to earn the really big money, then you probably, public law is probably not something you want to focus on. But that's not really the attraction for most people, who do it, including myself. And I think in terms of what sort of skills you need, I think it's very, very difficult to try and summarise in just a few minutes or one line what it is about public law. But most public law questions end up coming down to where you strike the balance between competing interests. That tends to be, if you wanted my one-line summary. And so I think an ability to understand in public life, because that's the sphere that you're operating in, what the competing interests are, and be able to weigh those up and have an understanding of how that balancing process works. It is different
in that sense from private law, if we're talking of very broad distinctions, where you're essentially just talking about the regulation between individuals of private rights and arbitrating between two competing individuals. Here, where you've got the state involved or an organ of the state, there is the public interest, and as I say, the issue is how that comes into play in a particular case and how you weigh the various elements of the public interest and reason your way through to a conclusion. Of course, lots of cases turn on statutory construction and narrow points like that, so that's a sort of the obvious caveat to what I'm saying. But in terms of if you're thinking, does it appeal to me, then I think you've got to have an interest in public affairs, public life, how the state interacts with individuals.